Well, good morning, Smoky Hill Vineyard. How is everybody? You're all my garage sailors, right? You're here and ready today. If I haven't met you yet, my name is Kristi. I'm one of the lead pastors here, and we are so thankful that you've joined us for worship this morning. We are continuing today our series on a seat at the table. Have you guys been enjoying this? A few weeks ago, we had Noelle kick us off with the whole idea of what does it mean to belong. I love how she talked about the disabled man who was invited in and where the lies in his life about belonging or not belonging were broken off. And then we had Mike kind of take us into this very deep Greek kind of discourse on what it means to be a part of God's family. And then last week, he talked about what does it mean to welcome well? Right? And I think my favorite quote out of his message last week was, sometimes it's a lot harder than Scripture makes it seem like it should be, right? Did that resonate with anybody else? Yes, I see some heads shaking. So today we're going to take a look at a very specific table, a wedding feast. But before we do that, I want you guys to take a moment and I want you to think with me about the most awkward table that you've ever sat at, okay? Like, really, truly engage for a moment. You know, Noelle took us through this beautiful thing of when did you belong? I want to take us the other way. When did you go to a table that felt so awkward? Maybe it was at church. Maybe it was a family holiday that all of a sudden took a really odd or difficult turn. Maybe it was like, I don't know, on public transport, or on an airplane, or in a corporate setting, or maybe just at the coffee table across looking at someone that you know, okay? So really close your eyes and let your heart kind of sit in that awkward place. And I began to wonder as I was thinking about all these different scenarios, if I'm the awkward one in every scenario, because I literally went, I can think of one there, I can think of one there, I can think of one there. But the one that struck me the most this week as I was prepping and preparing for the message was one that kind of crosses a few of those. It was my first experience at a small group. I was not attending church. My sister and her husband, I think they had just graduated college because I had just started college, and they invited me to come. They went to kind of this really wild church where you'd walk in and people's hands were raised and they were like praising God. And I'm like, I grew up in a Catholic liturgical background. I went, y'all are zealots. Like, I don't know what this is, but this is so foreign to me. And so they said, hey, you should come for our small group Thanksgiving dinner. And I was like, oh, that sounds sweet and weird. Like, holidays are hard enough. Why are you going to bring 8 different family units together and then you're going to throw open the doors and invite all these random family and friends? And I went in going, I love my sister and her husband. I'll go. I'll check it out. So I went, and as we all sat around the table, like, I genuinely could not figure it out. It was the weirdest group of gathering of people that I went, none of you fit together. Like, and you're all sharing your lives in this like really like vulnerable way. Like, you're talking about the things you actually need. You're talking about your wants and your brokenness. And I'm like, this is so awkward. Why did I come? Right? There's this incredible intimacy. And there's this one particular single mom and her son there, and they're talking about how they're really in need, and she can't get to work because she doesn't have her car broke down. And my brother-in-law, who I know is very poor, he's a college student, and I know he does not have really much to give, says, I feel like I'm supposed to give you my car. And I went, what are you talking about? What kind of generosity is that? Like, dude, how are you going to get to your job? Because I know you don't have money to go buy another car. Right? Have you ever been in a place like that where you go, who are these people at this table? It was so disorienting. How did I end up here? It was a vineyard, by the way. Those vineyard small groups, man, they're wild. And sometimes I think that this can be somewhat of our experience when we sit at the table that Jesus has prepared for us. Sometimes the people at the table look very different than maybe who we thought we would gather with. Maybe the way that they interact with one another is confusing and disorienting for us. Sometimes we might just feel overwhelmed at the depth of their need and even the way that Jesus responds to that. So if you'd like, we're going to go, if you want to turn with me in your Bible, we're going to Matthew 22, and we're going to look at the wedding banquet and the seat at the table that was set, the invitation that went out. So Matthew 22, 1 through 14. And I just want to invite you, if you don't have a Bible, we would like to give you one. We would like to send you home with one. I mean, there are tons of great apps that you can just download really easily and take it with you everywhere. But at the Connect table, we actually also have Bibles that we would love to bless you to take one home. And if you're online and you'd like one, you can text us SHV Church to 97,000 and then follow some prompts to get yourself a Bible, okay? All right, so the parable of the wedding banquet out of Matthew 22. Jesus spoke to them again in parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited, I've prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them and killed them, and the king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners, invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and they gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good. And the wedding hall was filled with guests." So wedding feasts, if you know anything about the first century, they were perhaps even bigger occasions and events than what they are today. Maybe not as extravagant or costly, but they were these huge celebrations for the family, for the whole community to gather together and celebrate what the Lord was doing. There's all kinds of symbolism. If you do any research about Jewish weddings, there's all of these incredible symbols. Some are really fun and lighthearted, and some are incredibly serious that point back to the bridegroom and the church and all these beautiful spiritually significant things. So what would happen with these wedding feasts, these invitations would go out well in advance. So families would work together to work out all the particulars of a marriage, which includes a dowry and all kinds of things. This would take some time. When all of the details had been decided, then the groom would leave the bride with her family, and they were what was considered betrothed. And so even though they weren't married yet and they hadn't consummated, they were considered married in the eyes of the culture. And then the groom would leave and go home, and he would prepare a place for his bride, for his new family. And sometimes that looked like building onto the existing home that they had. Sometimes it looked like building a separate little place on the property that his family had. He would go through lots and lots of preparation. People would have plenty of time to know that this wedding is coming. The invitations would have gone out, and then as soon as everything was ready, the groom had finished the completion, the addition on the home or building the home, and he would go to retrieve his bride and bring her home and marry her, okay? So in this case, I'm not going too far here, but I've got a couple of props that as I was thinking about what it looks like to prepare for a wedding feast. And I brought some of my pretty china. We're gonna hope this stays, so everyone just hang with us. So has anybody ever prepared a place setting before, right? If you prepare for a wedding, it's very extravagant, expensive china, invitations, cost, time, lots and lots of effort, right? And everything looks beautiful and it's all prepared. And this is for a king. And so his son is marrying. So there's this beautiful setting that's placed out. All the fancy pieces are in the right places, even if they won't stay on a music stand. They're all there. They look beautiful. I have a mug somewhere that I lost. That's okay. You get the point, right? And so everything's prepared and beautiful and ready. Now I want us to go to Luke. There's a parallel passage in Luke with the Matthew 22. It's actually Luke 14. It's called the Great Feast. And most of the story is very similar to the wedding banquet that we read about in Matthew. But there's a couple additional details that we get out of the Matthew version, out of the Luke version that I'd like to just highlight. So the second story out of Luke 14, the entire story is 15 through 24. We're just gonna look at a couple of verses. So the servants have gone out to gather the people who have been invited, and this is what they receive. They all alike began to make excuses, the invited guests. The first said, "I've just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me." Another said, I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen. I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me. Still another said, I just got married, so I can't come. I got my own wedding stuff to deal with, right? But understanding the excuses of this first century audience will help you understand how incredibly offensive these excuses were. To say I have to go off to my property, or I have to go off to my business, or I have to go take care of things with my spouse. You don't talk about those things. But they were also incredibly disruptive excuses. They were meant to derail the entire festivities that had been planned. These people who had given their word, they'd committed back when the groom and the bride's families made their decisions and they said, this wedding is coming, prepare. What an honor to be invited to the noble king's son's wedding. It reminds me a little bit of like the most recent royal wedding in the UK. Anybody watch any of that? I mean, everything was so extravagant. And that's what I think of when I read this. And in the Middle East, an excuse that says, oh, I've just bought land and I need to go check it out is completely like a false, hurtful lie. In the Middle East, where you're buying potentially desert, land that has maybe no water supply, you know everything about that plot of land before you buy it. You know where the sun hits, you know where the water runs, you know if there's plants and where they are, does everything wash out in the particular season. So the fact that they would say, I've just bought land, I haven't seen it, or oxen that I've never tried out, it'd be like us saying, oh, I just bought, well, I was gonna say a house, but in COVID, kind of some people did have to buy houses without seeing them, but pretend 2 years ago, you would say something like, oh, I just bought a house, I should go check it out, right? It's pretty absurd. But what we see in Luke also is that the master's response, in Matthew we saw that the king was very, very angry and enraged and pretty much he wiped out all of those hurtful people, which was very Old Testament. But in Luke, we see the master's response turn from wrath to mercy. We see in Luke that the king takes what could have been an anger response and instead turns it into this merciful invitation to those who otherwise would never have been invited to a seat at the table. So both of these stories, Matthew and Luke, would have been familiar to the first century Jewish audience. They actually point to a 700-year-old conversation that had been happening since Isaiah. In Isaiah 25, 6-9, we get a picture of what's called the Messianic Banquet. And Isaiah dreams of a great banquet to be held at the end of history in which the Lord of hosts spreads the banquet, serves the food of kings. It's held on a holy mountain of the Lord. The guests will include people from all Gentile nations. Death will be at an end. Tears will be wiped away. And it will be a glorious day of salvation. This comes from Kenneth Bailey's book, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. And so they would certainly have found this story familiar. They know a Messianic banquet is sometime coming. And so then for them to hear the story unravel that includes all of these offensive, ridiculous excuses, they would have been incredibly offended on behalf of the king. And you don't have to be a first century Jew to understand what this story feels like, do you? For many of us, we've experienced the reality of those who we love, maybe who have disappointed us, family members or dear friends who committed to be with us, to stand with us, whose actions maybe don't line up with what they'd committed, or their behavior is just confusing and hurtful, right? Maybe you've helped to plan a wedding. Maybe you've helped your child plan a wedding, and you know the expense and the effort and the process of making sure that every invited guest is accounted for and they're ready to come. Maybe it wasn't a wedding. Maybe you've crafted a holiday event where you've invited the whole family to come. And the turkey's ready and the mashed potatoes didn't burn and the green beans are still kind of warm and the rolls are out and they're buttered and browned perfectly and you're ready. You get your carving set out and you're like, okay guys, it's time. It's time. And everyone goes, oh man, I forgot I got to go water my plants. I just got that new Mac at the mall. I got to go pick it up. I haven't seen it yet. I'm just kind of tired. I got to go home and nap. Have you ever heard excuses like this? How deflating that is. And so maybe some of you go, I don't so much resonate with that, but maybe you actually resonate with the story out of the story of the excused guest. Maybe that, from that perspective and that their experience of the story, you go, oh, I've had times where I've had to bail on really important things. I had a wedding a few years ago that I ended up having a quasi-emergency surgery, and I had to miss a wedding. I was so devastated. It was a very dear friend. Her son was getting married. I'd helped prepare for the wedding. And I had to send somebody in my proxy, right? I had to send someone else to go for me. And I was devastated. And of course, when he got home, I'm like, tell me everything. What happened? I want every detail. You're a boy. You're not doing this well. Because it was my 20-something son. And I'm like, I need every detail, right? Or maybe when you hear these stories, you're moved on behalf of those uninvited guests who all of a sudden find themselves in this room. And they go, what am I doing here? How did I get in this place? They were simply living their life on the side of the road, walking down the road, on the country road. And these servants randomly show up and begin to implore them to come in. Have you ever been in rooms where you feel like, I do not belong? My husband he was on a former governor's faith council. He was a clergy representative. And I remember we got invited one year to the governor's Christmas party. So we're going to the governor's mansion for Christmas. And I'm like, what does that look like? Like, you're on the council, can't you go alone? Like, do I have to, what does overdress mean? What does underdress mean? How do you represent clergy well at a governor's Christmas party where they throw open the doors? And I'm in this place going, why? This is so bizarre. We don't belong here. How did we end up here? Or maybe there was a time where we ended up in a room with 8 other Denver pastors, and we were very closely in a conversation with one of the Pope's really good friends. And 2 of the people in the room had just literally been with the Pope. And his friend came to meet with us. We were talking about the beauty of bridging across faith, across denominations, across churches that historically had created division. And I found myself thinking, how am I in this room? I don't belong here. Am I supposed to kiss his? What do I do? So Kenneth Bailey says, when an outsider with no social status is invited to a banquet in the home of a nobleman, the outsider has a very hard time believing he's really wanted. On first exposure, grace is unbelievable. The recipient of the invitation will at once feel they don't really want me. Impossible. Look at who I am. The intent of the invitation is to impress me with the nobility of the master, but the invitation itself is not serious. The messenger in this story, of course, the servants who deliver such an extraordinary invitation will need a special way to convince the outsiders they are indeed invited and wanted. Understanding this, the master suggests when they are reluctant, grab them by the hand, drag them in if you have to. I want you by all means to convince them that the invitation is indeed serious and that they are genuinely welcome and wanted at my banquet. Do any of these experiences resonate for you? What about the experience of the servants? Have you thought about the servants in this story? From Matthew, we know they're responsible to go and do the gathering. They are literally the save the date and the hey, everything's ready, come in. That can't have been a small task for a royal family's wedding to say, come in, I have to go gather everyone up. And it doesn't go well, right? The guests refuse to come. Even more servants are sent, tell them the dinner's not ready, and they're mistreated. Some of them are even killed, right? They're seized, mistreated, killed. And the king says those invited don't deserve to come. He makes them, the new set of servants, then responsible to go out in the street where they experience more rejection. And then they get this really weird order to throw open the doors. Go bring everyone you can find in. So they did that, and it wasn't enough. So the king said, go, there's still room. Go and grab everyone down the country roads and bring them in. So they're given this incredibly hard job. They're rejected. They have to deliver some pretty tough news to the king, and then they get this confusing direction. They're the ones who have prepared the table. They're the ones who have spent all this time making sure everything is perfect. In fact, the servants would have been responsible for all of these guests who weren't the originally invited guests to prepare them to be before the king and his family. So they would have been given wedding clothes, and the servants would have been responsible to make sure that the guests that they called in are invited and made a seat at the table. I think that would have been very confusing for the servants. Probably incredibly frustrating, the amount of work, this swift change in direction. And I think for the audience listening to this parable would go, what? That sounds like a Messianic banquet gone terribly wrong. That sounds like a Messianic banquet that has the entire wrong guest list showing up. This is a problem. Like, this doesn't even make any sense. And then we see back to Matthew in verse 11, Matthew 22, verse 11. We see this really unusual fallout from the servants doing their job, their revised job, really well, or kind of well. When the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, "How did you get in here without wedding clothes, my friend?" The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, "Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen." Who knows what that reference, that tie them, throw them out into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, what does that signify? Anybody? This isn't rhetorical. You can actually shout out at me if you want. It's representative of hell. That's right. So I read this and I get very confused because these poor servants have done their job. Maybe not confused, maybe more like really a little bit enraged. Like, that's so unfair. The servants did this incredibly hard task. All along the way, it was incredibly difficult. They did what they were supposed to. They brought the people in. This guy doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing. He doesn't belong there. And yet there's a piece of the invitation, even for this uninvited, unexpected guest, where he refused to step fully into the invitation. That is, he was most certainly provided the wedding clothes, prepared by the servants as best as they could. There's something in him that went, well, I don't know why I'm here. Maybe I'll go. I'm making some assumptions, but I'm not going to do that. I don't need to honor that, wear that, on and on. And can you imagine what that one servant felt who plucked that guy off the street and brought him in? It must have been incredibly disheartening. I used to work in the corporate world for a really long time. And one of my clients, I worked in the tech industry, and one of my clients was a Hollywood studio. And so I worked directly with one of their high-level executives. And if you know anything about LA and kind of that culture, this particular executive was very well known and in an LA culture, very powerful. And we would go into restaurants and they would be like, "Oh, you're with so-and-so," and all of a sudden the whole restaurant would scurry and change around, and they would literally, like, a room that wasn't there would somehow materialize fully set and ready for the party that he waltzed in with, right? And I was thinking about this, and it's such a weird culture, and I thought, I wonder if this would be like him, this Hollywood studio executive, preparing a really incredible banquet, a dinner, a celebration of some sort. And then his invited guests, they just begin to fall off. They just give these really lame excuses. I'm busy, I'm tired, I'm whatever. And so if we were to see him like the king, running out and going to Skid Row. Have you ever been down Skid Row? It's incredibly disheartening, tense, and just people lined for what feels like forever under these concrete bridges, whole worlds that have been established and set up. And there's drug paraphernalia everywhere, and there's children, and there's elderly, and there's homeless, there's prostitutes, there's drug addicts. It's very, very hard. And I imagine him throwing open his doors and saying, "Go get everyone off Skid Row. They must be hungry for dinner tonight. Invite them in." How confusing would that have felt? And yet I feel like the servant's experience represents for us the reality of the upside down nature of God's kingdom. Throughout Scripture, over and over and over again, we see what causes us to recoil in our flesh and in our worldly desires, right? That we celebrate in persecution and in weakness, because in our weakness we're made strong. From 2 Corinthians. In Matthew, whoever desires to have self-preservation will actually lose their life. Those who willingly surrender will gain it. From Acts, that the Messiah would have to suffer, not be a conquering king who comes in to overturn the government and the authorities and the corruption, but a Messiah who must suffer, who then would send his message not just to the Jews, but to the Gentiles as well. This upside down nature. Jesus himself, who says it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have come not to call the righteous, but to call sinners. What a picture of the Messianic banquet gone wrong. Except that we know the end of the story. We know in Revelation it speaks to every tribe, every tongue, every nation represented in God's kingdom. We know where the story ends. Yet it pushes against everything that we hear is good from our culture, right? The invitation has gone out, and we get to choose how we're going to respond to that. Some of us will choose to say, no, thank you. Some of us will be ushered in where we go, how did I end up in here? Who brought me? The invitation has been sent, and the seat has been set. The table is set. And now for some of us, we might get confused because, oh, there's my other mug. Hey, we'll finish that one up. We might feel confused because sometimes the table looks a little bit different than we think. And the seat that has been set with a charger and a piece of china from IKEA, and maybe the salad plate that isn't even a plate. And the mug. And the mismatched china. And the bowl. And how someone's supposed to drink soup out of the colander. I don't know. And this mug that doesn't even stand right. It just keeps falling. It's so ugly. The invitation has been sent, and the table is set. So today, I don't know what the Lord is dialing up in you as you've considered maybe the different perspectives from the story, or maybe who's seated at the table, or why that is an ugly table setting. This is not what I'm doing for Thanksgiving. Or maybe it should be. Wouldn't that be funny? Then people would probably be like, yeah, I'm out. I think God's challenge to us today is, are we willing to embrace the table that's been, the seat that has been set, those that he chooses to sit across from us, even when it looks different than we think, even when we go, that's not even a table, that's like a podium, that's not even what I thought I was being invited to. We're gonna do something a little different for our ministry time today. There's a video by Amnesty International, and it's called Looking Beyond Borders, and it was created as this 4-minute experience that focuses on eye contact. That's it. No words, you're not supposed to speak, you're supposed to, two complete strangers be seated across from one another and to simply look at one another for 4 minutes. This is not a Christian experience or experiment, but I think the symbolism of what we see when we choose to stop and look at those seated at the table, in the eye, look at their value, look beyond our preconceived notions or what we think is really pretty and perfect, and be willing to embrace this eclectic, interesting thing. So we're going to do this. Online, there's a QR code that we've got a slide up there for you. We can't actually stream this online because of copyright. So we want to invite you into this ministry time of engaging with this video. What we want you to do, go ahead and scan the QR code, and you're going to be able to link out to the video and watch this with us. We're going to watch this after we shut down service here in the room. And I want to invite you to allow your heart to press into whatever it is that the Lord invites you into. Whatever it is that he would say today, whether it's an invitation that's being extended, or maybe a challenge to embrace those that sit across the table from you. And then if you would just spend a couple of minutes in prayer, it's kind of a long video, it's 4 minutes, spend a couple of minutes in prayer asking the Lord to set you free from anything he brings up, anything in your heart that responds. It can be anger, it can be tenderness, it can be tears, whatever it is. And in the room, we're actually going to do the same thing. We're going to watch this video together. And then we're going to invite the Lord to move on our hearts. And if you would like prayer, we're still going to offer actual in-person ministry time in the room and worship after the video. I would ask you to just engage, just allow the Lord to press into your heart this morning, and let's see what he wants to say. And then we're here. If you want to pray after, if you want to worship, if you want to respond in whatever way you're comfortable with, you're not alone. We are in this together.
Thank you again for joining with us live or through SHV at home today, especially if today was your first time.
If you're here in the room, Joan, our community life pastor, would love the chance to say hello and to help you get connected. She's back here in the back of the Connect corner, and she even has a gift for you if you're visiting.
I hope you have a peaceful and joyful week, full of God's Spirit. And we'd love to see you next week for Mother's Day, either in person or online.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a great week.
Bye.